The silence did not break gently. It shattered in the middle of Lady Winthrope's grand winter gathering, right beneath the heavy gold chandeliers and the polite laughter of people who spent their lives pretending to be perfect. I stood there, holding a glass of lemon water that felt like a block of ice in my hand. One moment, the room was a hum of violins and soft chatter. The next, a whispered accusation, soft, surgical, and absolutely devastating, rippled through the crowd. Every head turned. Every fan dropped an inch. The predatory gaze of the elite settled on me, Miss Seraphine Valehart, the daughter of a family whose name had been unimpeachable for 3 generations. I didn't move. I couldn't. My breath was stolen as if someone had punched the air from my lungs. The stillness in that instant spoke louder than any denial I could have shouted. I could feel the heat rising in my neck, but my face remained frozen. To them, my silence was a confession. To me, it was the realization that the world I had always known, a world of rules, respectability, and safety, was dissolving. This was known to be a dangerous season, though no one ever used that word aloud. We spoke of opportunities and alliances, but we all knew we were walking on thin ice. Tonight, the ice finally cracked under my feet. The cruelty wasn't just in what was said, it was in the timing. It was a calculated public execution, designed to destroy me before I could even find the words to ask why. The weight of the room became a physical force, pressing against my shoulders until I thought I might collapse. No one stepped forward to ask if I was all right. No one even dared to look me directly in the eye once the initial shock passed. Instead, they began to retreat. It was a slow, coordinated movement, like a tide pulling back from a cursed shore. Groups of 3 and 4 drifted away, their whispers creating a low, buzzing sound that filled the vacuum of the ballroom. I was suddenly standing in a circle of empty floor, an island of disgrace in a sea of silk and velvet. This was how society killed you. They didn't use blades. They used distance. They simply acted as if you had already ceased to exist. I looked toward my parents, hoping for a sign of support, but they were staring at the floor, their faces pale with a mixture of shame and horror. My reputation, something we had polished like fine silver every day of my life, was tarnished beyond repair in less than 60 seconds. The isolation was absolute. I felt the stinging prickle of tears behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. If I was to be ruined, I would be ruined with my head held high. Just as I prepared to turn and flee the room, I noticed something that stopped me. In the corner of the room, near the velvet drapes, one man did not look away. He wasn't whispering. He wasn't retreating. He was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. The man was Mr. Alistair Rivenmere. He was a man of high standing, known for being composed, observant, and entirely uninterested in the petty dramas of the ton. He was the kind of person who usually stood on the edges of society, watching the games without playing them. Now, he did the unthinkable. While the rest of the room was moving away from me, Alistair Rivenmere began to walk toward me. His boots clicked rhythmically against the polished wood, a steady sound in a room full of chaotic whispers. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the gasps that followed his movement. When he reached me, he didn't offer a pitying look. He simply stood beside me, his presence solid and grounding. By standing there, he was breaking the invisible barrier society had built around me. It was its own scandal. A man of his reputation associating with a girl who had just been publicly accused of a nameless sin was social suicide. I looked up at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. "Mr. Rivenmere," I whispered, my voice trembling. "You shouldn't be here. You'll be pulled down with me." He didn't flinch. He adjusted his cuffs and looked out at the room as if we were merely discussing the weather. "Let them pull," he said quietly. "The view from the bottom might be more honest than the one from the top." I wondered why he would risk everything for someone he barely knew. As Alistair stood by me, my eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the whisper. I found her near the refreshment table. Lady Corazanne Thornvale was watching us, a glass of dark wine in her hand. She didn't look angry, she looked triumphant. Her smile was small, polished, and terrifyingly calm. It was the smile of a hunter who had finally caught a long-pursued prey. Corazanne had been my friend once, or so I thought. We had grown up in the same circles, shared secrets over tea, and navigated our first seasons together. But seeing her now, I realized that every smile she had ever given me was a mask. The betrayal hit me harder than the accusation itself. I recognized the precision of the strike. The whisper hadn't been a random act of malice. It had been timed to the exact moment my father was discussing a major business merger. It was designed to hurt not just me, but the entire Valehart legacy. Corazanne took a slow sip of her wine, her eyes locking onto mine for a brief second before she turned to the woman beside her to continue the gossip. I felt a cold chill settle in my chest. I knew she was the architect, the person who had whispered the lie that was now becoming my truth. But the question that haunted me was, why? What motive could possibly justify such a surgical destruction of my life? What had I done to deserve this kind of hate? To understand why this was happening, I had to look back at the start of the season. They called it the winter season, but it was more like a war. In our world, social games weren't just for fun, they were for survival. Families were constantly moving like chess pieces, trying to secure better titles, larger dowries, and more influence. Invisible rivalries simmered beneath the surface of every dinner party. Strategic courtships were arranged behind closed doors, often before the couple had even met. I had always been a quiet player in these games, following the rules my mother taught me. I was the respectable one. I never laughed too loudly, never danced too many times with the same man, and always kept my letters polite and professional. I thought my respectability was my armor. I believed that if I never broke a rule, I could never be hurt. But I didn't realize that in a game of predators, the one who plays by the rules is the easiest to target. My sincerity was seen as a weakness. While others were calculating their every move, I was genuinely trying to find a connection with people. I had been vulnerable without even knowing it, leaving a trail of honesty that someone like Corazon could easily twist into something ugly. I had been walking through a minefield, thinking I was in a garden. The next morning, the reality of my situation arrived in the form of a heavy silence at the breakfast table. My father wouldn't look at me, and my mother's eyes were red from crying. "It's about a letter, Seraphine," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. "Lady Corazon claims to have found a letter you wrote. A letter that proves things." My heart stopped. I hadn't written any letters that were scandalous. I lived a life of boring, painful respectability. What letter? I demanded. What could it possibly say? The truth was that Corazon did possess something. It wasn't just a rumor, she had physical evidence. The rumor mill said the letter was found in an old desk at a summer estate, and that it contained a secret that would unmake the Valehart name. If such a letter existed, it meant my secret wasn't just a mistake I had made, it was something deeper, something rooted in my family's past. I realized that the truth Corazon was wielding had substance, even if it was a lie built on a grain of reality. I felt like I was drowning in a sea of paper. What truth could be so powerful that it could turn my own parents against me? What had I said, or what had someone else said, in a moment of privacy that was now being used as a weapon in the light of day? The Valehart family did not scream or throw things. We were far too respectable for that. Instead, my parents responded with a chilling restraint that felt more lethal than any anger. They moved through the house like ghosts, avoiding my gaze and speaking to me only in short, functional sentences. It was a form of emotional abuse that made me feel like a stranger in my own home. Every time I tried to defend myself, my father would hold up a hand and walk away. Their disappointment was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I was trapped in a house that no longer wanted me. My dread deepened with every passing hour. I knew that in society's eyes, a woman's value was tied to her family's approval. If my own parents didn't stand by me, I was truly lost. I spent hours in my room, staring out the window at the grey winter sky, wondering how a lifetime of good behavior could be erased in a single night. I realized then that respectability was a fragile veneer. It was a thin layer of gold leaf over common lead. Once it was scratched, everyone stopped seeing the gold and only saw the base metal underneath. I was no longer a daughter. I was a liability. And liabilities in our world were meant to be liquidated. By the end of the week, a solution was proposed. My father called me into his study, the room smelling of tobacco and old leather. He didn't ask me to sit. "Lord Galsworthy has expressed an interest in marriage," he said, his voice cold and flat. "Despite the current climate, he is willing to take you to his estate in the north. Immediately." I felt a jolt of horror. Lord Galsworthy was a man twice my age, known for being a cruel and humorless widower. This wasn't a marriage, it was an exile. It was a bargain designed to neutralize the damage to the family name. If I married and moved away, the scandal would have nowhere to land. I would be hidden away in a drafty castle, and the Valeharts could go back to their perfect lives. My autonomy was being sold to pay for a mistake I didn't even understand. "You cannot be serious," I whispered. "You would sell me to a man like that just to stop people from whispering?" My father finally looked at me, his eyes hard. "You brought this upon us, Seraphine. You will be the one to fix it." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say yes just to end the tension, to escape the house that felt like a prison. But another part of me knew that if I boarded that carriage, I would never truly be free again. Before the arrangements with Lord Galsworthy could be finalized, an unexpected guest arrived at our door. Alistair Rivenmere didn't wait for a formal invitation. He walked into my father's study with an unsettling composure that made my father look like a bumbling child. "I hear there are talks of a marriage," Alistair said, his voice calm but possessing a sharp edge. My father bristled. "This is a private family matter, Rivenmere. It does not concern you." Alistair leaned against the doorframe, his gaze moving to me for a brief second before returning to my father. "Everything concerning the Valehart legacy concerns me," Alistair replied. The tension in the room escalated until it was almost impossible to breathe. My father looked confused, then angry. "What are you talking about? You have no tie to us." Alistair didn't answer immediately. He took a slow breath and looked at the books on the shelves. "You are trying to hide her away because you are afraid of what Lady Corazand found. But selling your daughter to Galsworthy won't stop the truth from coming out. It will only make you look more guilty." I watched him, stunned. He was fighting for me in a way my own father wouldn't. But as he spoke, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a shadow of a secret. His connection to this scandal was deeper than just a gentleman's kindness. The next day, Alistair met me in the garden. He looked tired, the shadows under his eyes darker than usual. "I need to tell you what is in that letter, Seraphine," he said. "Because your parents won't, and Corazand will only tell the version that hurts the most." I held my breath, the cold air stinging my lungs. "The letter isn't about a secret lover or a moment of weakness," he continued. "It's a document from 30 years ago. It's a letter from your grandfather to his lawyer, discussing the legitimacy of the Valehart inheritance." The stakes exploded in my mind. In our world, land and money were everything. If there was a question about who truly owned the Valehart estates, my family would be bankrupt. But it was worse than that. The letter suggested that my father wasn't the rightful heir, which meant I wasn't who I thought I was. My very identity was implicated. I wasn't a girl of unimpeachable respectability whose reputation had been tarnished. I was a girl whose entire life was built on a lie. The scandal wasn't about my behavior. It was about my blood. I felt a wave of nausea. No wonder my parents were so desperate to hide me away. If the world found out the truth, we wouldn't just be disgraced, we would be nothing. I began to realize that Lady Corazand Thornvale wasn't just being a mean girl. Her motives were far more complex. Through Alistair, I learned that her own family was on the verge of financial ruin. Her father had gambled away their fortune, and they were desperate for a way to stay afloat. If she could prove the Valehart inheritance was illegitimate, she could potentially claim a portion of it for her own family through an old distant connection. It was strategic survival, disguised as social cruelty. This made her much more dangerous. She wasn't acting out of passion, she was acting out of necessity. But as I watched her from a distance at a small tea party later that week, I noticed something. She wasn't looking at me with the same triumph anymore. She looked nervous. She kept glancing at a man in the corner, a man I didn't recognize. It became clear that Corazand wasn't the only one pulling the strings. Someone else was manipulating the events, someone who was using Corazand as a tool to destroy us all. The plot was getting larger, and I was caught in the middle of a web that stretched far beyond the ballrooms of the season. The mystery deepened when a name I had never heard was mentioned by a servant in our house. "It's the same as what happened to Julian," I heard the cook whisper to the maid. When I asked my mother who Julian was, she went deathly pale and left the room without a word. I spent the afternoon in the attic, digging through old trunks until I found a small, dusty portrait. It was a young man with eyes that looked exactly like mine. On the back, in faded ink, was the name Julian Valehart. Why had his name been erased from our history? I searched the family Bible, but the page for that year had been torn out. It was a missing piece of the puzzle that felt vital. Julian had clearly been part of the family, yet there were no stories about him, no mentions of his life or his death. He was a ghost haunting the edges of our respectability. I realized that whatever had happened to him was tied to the letter Corazand held. The erasure of his name was a deliberate act by my parents to protect the lie they were living. I felt a surge of anger. They had built their perfect life on the bones of someone they had discarded, and now I was being discarded to keep those bones buried. Alistair eventually told me the truth about his own family. "My father was Julian's closest friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "They were like brothers. But when the scandal broke, the first scandal, 30 years ago, my family was forced to distance themselves. We were told Julian had committed a crime. We were told he was the one who tried to steal the inheritance. He looked at me, his gaze searching. But seeing what they are doing to you, Seraphine, I realized the story we were told was a lie. Julian wasn't the villain. He was the one who found the truth, just like you are now. The emotional tension between us was nearly breaking. He was helping me because he felt he owed it to the man his family had abandoned. But as he spoke, I noticed he was holding back. There's more, isn't there? I asked. He looked away, his jaw tightening. The letter Corisande has. It's not the only copy. And it's not the most dangerous part of the story. He wouldn't say more, leaving me with a sense of impending doom. He was withholding something critical, something that he thought might break me entirely. I realized that in this season of unmaking, even my allies had secrets that could destroy me. Public perception of me continued to spiral downward. I was no longer invited anywhere, and even when I walked down the street, people crossed the road to avoid me. My dignity was under a constant, relentless siege. I felt like a ghost walking through a world that had moved on. My parents were finalizing the papers for the marriage to Galsworthy, and the carriage was scheduled to arrive on Monday. I was out of time and out of options. Then, an unexpected ally appeared. Lady Winthrope, the woman whose party had started the whole disaster, sent me a private note. "Come to my house at midnight," it read. "I have something you need to see." I snuck out of the house, my heart racing, and met her in her private library. She didn't look like the grand, judgmental hostess I remembered. She looked tired and sad. "I am tired of watching the same play happen over and over, Seraphine," she said, handing me a small, rusted key. "This belongs to a house in the old district. A widow lives there who has been waiting for you to come for a long time." The widow was Mrs. Fenwick Halberd. She lived in a house filled with cats and the scent of dried herbs. She was socially invisible, someone the Ton would never acknowledge, but she had been observant for decades. "I was the maid who served your grandfather," she told me, her eyes sharp despite her age. "I saw the letter being written. I saw the fight that followed." She held the decisive knowledge that could change everything. She explained that the letter wasn't a claim of illegitimacy, it was a confession of a theft. My grandfather hadn't been the rightful heir, but he had stolen the papers that proved his brother, Julian, was the true owner of the estates. My entire family line was built on a crime. Mrs. Halberd had kept the original documents hidden for 30 years, waiting for someone with the courage to face the truth. "But there is a cost, child," she warned. "If you use these papers to save your reputation, you will destroy your family's fortune. You will be respectable, but you will be poor, and your parents will likely go to prison." The truth was offered to me, but the price was everything I had ever known. The revelation of my birth was the final blow. Mrs. Halberd pulled out a final paper, one that hadn't been mentioned in the rumors. "Julian didn't just have the right to the land," she said softly. "He had a daughter. A daughter your father claimed as his own to keep the secret buried." I stared at her, the room spinning. I wasn't my father's daughter. I was Julian's. My parents were actually my uncle and aunt who had stolen my father's life and then raised me as a pawn to protect their theft. The emotional shock was so great that I couldn't even cry. My respectability was completely destabilized. Every memory I had of my childhood felt like a scene from a play I hadn't known I was starring in. The disappointment they felt in me wasn't about my behavior. It was about the fear that I was finally becoming like my biological father. They didn't love me. They feared me. I was a living reminder of the crime they committed every morning when they woke up in that grand house. I was the secret they couldn't quite bury. Strangely, as I was falling apart, the antagonist began to falter as well. Corisande Thornvale came to see me in secret. She didn't look like the triumphant hunter anymore. Her eyes were red, and her hands were shaking. "I didn't know it was this deep, Seraphine," she whispered. "I just wanted to save my family. I didn't know I was helping him destroy everything." "Helping who?" I asked, my voice cold. "The man you were looking at the tea party," she said. "Lord Galsworthy. He's the one who gave me the letter. He's the one who told me to whisper the rumor." I realized the trap was even more perfect than I had imagined. Galsworthy wanted to marry me so he could gain legal control over me and the documents. He was the one who had been manipulating Corisande, using her desperation to do his dirty work. Corisande's doubt and regret were real, but it was almost too late. Her own vulnerability was revealed. She was just another pawn in Galsworthy's game. We were two girls being unmade by the same man's greed. The grand public event of the season, the Winter Equinox Ball, was only 2 days away. It was the night my engagement to Galsworthy was supposed to be announced. I knew it was the moment of the final confrontation. I had the papers from Mrs. Halberd, and I had the truth about my birth. But I also knew that if I spoke out, I would be setting a fire that would consume everyone, including myself. Alistair came to me one last time. "Whatever you choose, I will stand by you," he said. "But the storm is here, Seraphine. You can either let it wash you away, or you can be the lightning." I looked at the papers in my hand. I thought about Julian, the man who had been erased. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who thought respectability was the same as goodness. The final confrontation was inevitable. I wouldn't go to the ball as a bride. I would go as a judge. The day of the ball was the longest of my life. The house was filled with the bustle of servants preparing my gown, a dress of pure, blinding white that felt like a shroud. The silence in the house was thick with dread. My parents were acting as if everything was back to normal, their faces set in masks of rigid, polite happiness. They thought they had won. They thought the marriage would seal the secret forever. I spent the hours in my room, not speaking, not eating. I felt a strange compression in my chest, a build-up of all the words I hadn't said for 20 years. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the respectable Miss Valehart. I saw the daughter of a man who had been wronged. I saw a person who was no longer afraid of being ruined, because I had already been unmade. The cliffhanger was clear. Who would speak first? Who would pull the trigger on the final explosion? I tucked the original documents into the hidden pocket of my skirts and prepared to walk into the lion's den. The ballroom was a sea of light and color, but to me, it felt like a battlefield. When I entered with my uncle, the man I had called father, the room went silent. Then, Lord Galsworthy stepped forward, a smug smile on his face. He reached for my hand to lead me to the center of the floor for the announcement. "I believe there is something that needs to be said before any vows are made," I said, my voice ringing out clearly through the hall. The social confrontation was explosive. My uncle tried to pull me away, his hand gripping my arm with bruising force. "She's unwell," he cried to the crowd. "The stress has been too much." But I pulled free and held up the papers. "The stress of living a lie is what is too much," I shouted. I began to tell the story, not the rumor Corazon had spread, but the real story. I told them about Julian. I told them about the theft. I told them about my birth. The unexpected truth disrupted the entire narrative of the season. The gazes that had been predatory turned to looks of pure, unadulterated shock. As I spoke, the reframing of the scandal was complete. I wasn't the one who had committed a sin. I was the victim of a generational crime. The blame began to shift visibly. The crowd looked at my uncle and aunt with a new kind of horror. People who had been their friends for decades backed away as if they were poisonous. The documents I held were passed to Sir Benedict, a high-ranking official who was in the crowd. He examined them with a grim face. "These are authentic," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "The seals are real. The confession is dated." The silence that followed was different than the one at the start of the season. It wasn't the silence of judgment for me. It was the silence of a world realizing its foundations were rotten. My uncle collapsed into a chair, his face grey. My aunt began to wail, a sound of pure terror. The season had unmade them all, just as I had promised. Lady Corazon Thornvale was standing near the edge of the crowd. When she saw the tide turn, her mask finally fractured. She didn't look like a strategist anymore. She looked like a frightened girl who had realized she had been standing on the wrong side of history. She saw the guards moving toward her father, and she knew her family's ruin was now certain as well. Human fear replaced her cold calculation. She looked at me, her eyes pleading for some kind of mercy. I saw her for what she was, a product of the same cruel system that had tried to crush me. She had been taught that survival required the destruction of others. My response was uncertain even to myself. Part of me wanted to see her fall just as hard as I had. But another part of me was tired of the cycle of ruin. The power was in my hands now, and for the first time, I had to decide what kind of person I was going to be. I stepped toward the center of the room, but I didn't use the moment for a theatrical vengeance. I didn't scream or point fingers. I simply stood there as the guards led my uncle and aunt away. I refused the role of the vengeful victim. My moral strength was in my calm. "I do not wish for more scandals," I said to the gathered elite. "I only wish for the truth to be the end of it." The crowd was stunned. They expected a show, a dramatic outpouring of anger. But by refusing to be cruel, I was showing them a dignity they didn't know how to handle. I was reclaiming my respectability, but on my own terms, not through silence, but through an honest peace. I looked at Alistair, who was watching me with a look of profound respect. The season was over, and while the Valehart name was destroyed, Seraphine was finally alive. In the aftermath, the true villain was fully exposed. Lord Galsworthy tried to flee the ballroom, but Alistair blocked his path. It was revealed that Galsworthy had known the truth for years and had been blackmailing my uncle. He had orchestrated the entire season to force me into marriage so he could own the Valehart lands legally. He was the one who had pushed Corazon to start the rumors, knowing it would isolate me. The final power shift was absolute. Galsworthy was stripped of his titles and faced charges of blackmail and fraud. The hidden manipulator was no longer hidden, and the world saw the rot for what it was. I felt a strange sense of relief. The danger was gone, and the people who had tried to play me like a chess piece were the ones who had lost the game. I stood in the empty ballroom as the sun began to rise, the lights of the chandeliers finally flickering out. Social power in the county recalibrated quickly. The respectable families scrambled to distance themselves from the old Valehart name, while new alliances were formed in the vacuum. I was left with the ruins of a fortune and a name that was now synonymous with a great tragedy. But strangely, I felt lighter than I ever had. Respectability was being redefined. It was no longer about what you had, but about who you were when everything was taken away. I decided to sell the manor and the lands to pay off the debts my uncle had incurred. I gave the remaining money to Mrs. Halberd and the other servants who had been treated poorly. Personal closure remained the only thing I needed. I had the truth, but I still had to decide where I belonged in a world that no longer had a pre-written script for me. I was no longer an heiress, but I was finally a Valehart. A week after the ball, I requested a private conversation with Corazon. We met in a small park, far from the prying eyes of the ton. There were no fans to hide behind, no silk dresses to give us status. We were just two young women sitting on a wooden bench in the cold. "Why did you do it, really?" I asked. The raw honesty of the moment was jarring. Corazon didn't look away. "Because I was told that if I didn't, we would be on the streets," she said. "I thought I could control the fire. I thought I could hurt you just enough to get what I needed and then stop." She looked at her hands. "I was a fool. I thought the season was a game I could win, but it was just a trap for all of us." We sat in silence, the weight of our shared history between us. As Corazon spoke, I saw the fear that had lived beneath her strategy. She told me about the night she spent crying, terrified that her father would be taken to debtor's prison. She spoke of the desperation that led her to trust Galsworthy, even when she knew he was a monster. Her truth was one of survival, desperation, and a paralyzing terror of ruin. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it gave her an emotional depth I hadn't seen before. She wasn't a villain. She was a victim who had tried to become a villain to stay alive. I realized that the dangerous season had been a test of character, and we had both failed in different ways until the very end. The cruelty of our world was that it forced you to choose between your soul and your safety. I looked at her and felt a surge of firm compassion. "I cannot be your friend, Corazon," I said. "What you did was a choice that broke something forever. But I will not see you ruined." I told her that I had found evidence that her family's debt had been illegally inflated by Galsworthy. I had turned the papers over to Sir Benedict, which would save her family from the streets. It was a deeply satisfying emotional release. I wasn't being weak. I was being merciful. I was choosing to end the cycle of destruction. Corazon started to cry, not the fake tears of a socialite, but the heavy, gasping sobs of someone who had been holding their breath for a year. I didn't hug her. I just sat with her until she was quiet. I was walking away from the war, and I was leaving the door open for her to do the same. The silence that had shattered at Lady Winthrope's party finally broke in a new way. It was a silence of reconciliation, not the kind where you go back to how things were, but the kind where you reach an understanding of the wreckage. I moved into a small house in the city, far from the grand manners. Alistair visited me every day. We didn't talk about the season or the scandal. We talked about the future. We weren't the perfect couple the ton would have expected. We were two people who had seen the worst of each other and stayed anyway. The understanding we shared was stronger than any alliance negotiated behind a fan. The noise of society continued, but for the first time in my life, I couldn't hear it. I was listening to the sound of my own heart, which was beating with a rhythm that was entirely my own. The season that unmade us all was finally over. The winter had passed, and the first hints of spring were beginning to show in the city gardens. I looked back at the girl I was at Lady Winthrope's ball, the one who stood in the center of a circle of judgment, and I barely recognized her. She had come from respectability, but she had found her soul in the ruin. Alistair and I walked through the park, his hand in mine. We had hard-earned dignity, emotional closure, and a life that was honest. Society would always have its seasons, its whispers, and its cruelties, but we were no longer its subjects. We had been unmade, yes, but in the breaking, we had been freed. The season had taken our names, our fortunes, and our safety, but it had given us the truth. And in the end, that was the only respectability that ever really mattered.